My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm 41 years old, and for 6 years, I thought I knew exactly what my husband did on the second Tuesday of every month. He went to Harrisburg, 3 hours north, a regional sales meeting for the medical equipment company he'd worked for since before we met. He left Tuesday morning, stayed overnight at the Marriott on 4th Street. I had seen the receipts, I had seen the loyalty points accumulate in an account I had access to, and came back Wednesday evening, tired, a little quiet, sometimes with a headache that he said came from the conference room's fluorescent lighting. For 6 years, I packed his bag for those trips. I want you to sit with that for a second. 6 years, 72 trips. I ironed his shirts the night before. I made sure his phone charger was in the side pocket. I kissed him goodbye in the driveway and waved until his car turned the corner. And then I went back inside and lived my life for 26 hours. And when he came home, I asked how the meeting went, and he told me, in the specific, tired shorthand of a man who has spent a day in a windowless room listening to quarterly projections, and I believed him. I want to be precise about something before I go further, because I think precision is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I was not a suspicious wife. I was not the kind of woman who checks phones or asks too many questions or feels a cold spike of dread every time her husband's name lights up with a text from someone she doesn't recognize. I trusted Daniel. Yes, his name was also Daniel, which is a coincidence I have thought about more than I should, the way you trust gravity. Not because I had tested it, because it had simply never given me a reason to think about it at all. That is, I have learned since, exactly the kind of trust that gets exploited most efficiently. Dr. Shirley Glass, the psychologist who spent decades studying infidelity and wrote the landmark book Not Just Friends, found in her research that the spouses least likely to detect an affair were not the inattentive ones. They were the trusting ones, the ones whose baseline assumption about their partner was so stable, so load-bearing, that small inconsistencies simply had nowhere to land. A suspicious person notices a wrinkle in the story. A trusting person doesn't see the wrinkle because they're not looking at the fabric that closely in the first place. I was not looking at the fabric. The pattern started the way patterns always start, invisibly. Not as a pattern at all, just as a series of unconnected facts that each had their own perfectly reasonable explanation, the way individual threads have no shape until someone steps back far enough to see the weave. The first thing, though I didn't notice it as a first thing until much later, reconstructing the timeline the way you reconstruct a crime scene after you already know what happened, was that Daniel started buying new clothes for the Harrisburg trips. Not dramatically, a few new shirts over the course of a year, nicer than what he usually wore to work. When I asked about it, he said his manager had mentioned dressing more sharply for the regional meetings, that there were people from corporate who came down sometimes, that it mattered for how he was perceived. That explanation made sense. It still makes sense in isolation. That's the thing about a single thread. It can be anything. It's only when you have enough of them that a shape starts to emerge, and even then, the shape only becomes visible if you're looking for it, and I wasn't looking for anything, because there was nothing yet that told me to look. The second thing was the gym bag. Daniel had never been someone who exercised on business trips. He'd joke about hotel gyms, a treadmill and a single dumbbell, like they're daring you to use it. And for years, the gym bag stayed in the hall closet, untouched, except for the one time we'd gone to the Poconos for a long weekend, and he'd packed it out of some vague aspirational impulse, and then never opened it. About 4 years ago, the gym bag started going to Harrisburg with him. I didn't think anything of it. I was, if anything, a little pleased. He'd mentioned wanting to get back in shape, the way men in their 40s sometimes do, a small private campaign against the idea of getting older. He came back from those trips saying he'd used the hotel gym, that it had actually been pretty decent, that he felt better for it. I told him that was great. I meant it. The third thing, and this is the one that, looking back, I think was actually the first crack, the place where, if I'd been paying closer attention, I might have felt something shift, was that around the same time, Daniel started being slightly less available by phone during those overnight trips. Not unavailable, that's important. If he'd gone completely dark, I would have noticed immediately, would have called the hotel, would have worried something was wrong. What happened instead was subtler. He used to call me every evening around 8, after dinner, just to check in. 15, 20 minutes, nothing important, just the sound of each other's day. Around 4 years ago, those calls started getting shorter, then less frequent. Then, eventually, they became texts. Long day, talk tomorrow, love you. I told myself it was the job. He'd been promoted the year before, more responsibility, more evening calls with people in different time zones, more genuine exhaustion. And honestly, that's exactly what it looked like. Exhaustion looks the same whether it comes from overwork or from something else entirely. A man who is tired from sitting in meetings all day, and a man who is tired from maintaining two different lives for 30 hours straight, will, from the outside, present almost identically. Both of them will say, long day. Both of them will want to go to bed early. Neither version requires an explanation beyond the one you're already prepared to accept. Dr. Dan Ariely, in The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, writes about what he calls the fudge factor, the psychological mechanism by which people who are deceiving someone they love don't experience it as one enormous lie, but as a long series of small, manageable omissions, each one individually justifiable, each one small enough not to register as a betrayal in the moment it's committed. The shorter phone call isn't a lie, it's just a shorter phone call. The new shirt isn't a lie, it's just a shirt. Ariely's research suggests that this incrementalism is precisely what makes long-term deception sustainable, not because the deceiver is a master manipulator, but because the human mind, including the deceiver's own, is remarkably good at not adding things up. I wasn't adding things up either. For 6 years, I didn't add anything up because there was nothing dramatic enough to add. Just shirts, just a gym bag, just shorter phone calls that I attributed, generously and reasonably, to a demanding job and a tired man. What changed, what finally, after 6 years, gave me a single thread I couldn't explain away, happened on an ordinary Tuesday in March, when Daniel left for Harrisburg the way he always did, and I went to put a stack of folded towels away in the linen closet, and found, tucked behind the extra pillows on the top shelf, a birthday card. It wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't addressed to anyone, actually. It was blank inside, unsigned, the kind of card you buy and then forget you bought, or buy as a spare for some future occasion you haven't decided on yet. On the front of the card was a cartoon illustration of a little girl blowing out candles on a cake. 5 candles. I want to tell you that I felt something immediately. I didn't. I stood there holding a blank birthday card with 5 candles on it, in a house where there were no children, where there had never been children. Daniel and I had decided, early and mutually, not to have kids, a decision I had never once regretted and had no reason to believe he had either. And for a long moment I simply felt confused. The specific, mild confusion of finding an object that doesn't belong to the story you're currently living in. I put it back. I told myself it was probably something from his sister, who had kids, who he sometimes bought gifts for. I closed the linen closet and went downstairs and made dinner for one and didn't think about it again. Except that 2 weeks later, the card was gone, and in its place, tucked into the exact same spot, behind the extra pillows on the top shelf, where no one would look unless they were specifically looking, was a receipt. A receipt from a toy store in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, dated the Tuesday before. $41.17 for a child's bicycle helmet, size small, and a box of birthday candles. A receipt does not accuse anyone. I want to be clear about that, because it's the thing I kept telling myself for the better part of a week. A receipt is just paper. It doesn't have an opinion. It doesn't know what it implies. The $41.17 could have been for his sister's kid. The bicycle helmet could have been a thoughtful uncle's impulse buy in a gift shop while killing time before a meeting. People buy strange things on business trips. People buy things they forget about. There were 100 explanations, and every single one of them was perfectly reasonable. And I lay awake at 2 a.m, constructing each of them with the careful, desperate architecture of someone building a bridge they already suspect won't hold weight. What I want you to understand is that I did not, in that first week, set out to investigate my husband. That word, investigate, implies an intention I didn't have yet. What I had instead was a question. A small, specific, answerable question. Whose birthday is in March? And does anyone in Daniel's family have a child turning 5? That's all. That's the whole thing. I wasn't trying to catch him at anything. I was trying to make the receipt make sense. The way you try to make any small inconsistency make sense. The way you double-check a number in a spreadsheet that didn't add up. Not because you suspect fraud, but because you want the spreadsheet to be correct. So I called his sister Patricia on a Thursday afternoon, under the entirely true pretense of asking about Easter plans. And in the middle of the conversation, lightly, the way you ask something you've already decided isn't important, I asked, "Does Mason have a birthday coming up? I feel like I'm forgetting something." Mason was Patricia's son. He was 11. "No," she said. "Mason's birthday is in September. Why?" "No reason," I said. "I just had it in my head for some reason. Must be thinking of someone else." I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I want to describe what I felt in that moment because I think it's different from what people expect. I didn't feel suspicious of Daniel exactly, not yet. What I felt was a kind of vertigo, the specific disorientation of realizing that a fact you had filed under minor and explainable had just lost its explanation and now existed in your mind with nowhere to go. Dr. Jennifer Freyd, the psychologist who developed the theory of betrayal blindness, describes this as the moment the mind first registers a piece of information it cannot yet integrate. Not denial, not yet, but a kind of suspended holding. The fact is real, the fact is acknowledged, but the fact has not yet been allowed to mean anything. I held the receipt in that suspended state for exactly 4 more days. On the 5th day, I did the thing that, looking back, was the actual beginning of everything that followed, though it didn't feel like a beginning at the time. It felt like nothing. It felt like opening a banking app on my phone, the way I did every week or two to check on our joint account, the way I had done 1,000 times before without anything happening as a result. Except this time, instead of just glancing at the balance, I scrolled back. Not far, just to the last Harrisburg trip 3 weeks earlier. I wanted to see the hotel charge. The Marriott on 4th Street. I'd seen it 100 times. I wanted, I think, to see it again, to have it be there, ordinary and confirming, the way it always had been, so that I could put the receipt and the phone call and the whole strange week behind me. The Marriott charge was there, $189, exactly what it always was. But below it, the same date, 4 hours later, was a second charge, a grocery store, $36, in Harrisburg. Daniel didn't grocery shop on business trips. In 6 years, I had never once seen a grocery charge from one of his Harrisburg trips. Hotels have room service. Conferences have catered lunches. Why would a man staying overnight in a hotel room, alone, need to buy $36 of groceries? I sat with that question the way you sit with a splinter you can feel but haven't located yet, aware of it, unable to ignore it, not yet able to do anything about it. I went back further, 6 months. I want to tell you what I found, because I think the shape of what I found matters more than any single piece of it. Every single Harrisburg trip, for at least the past 6 months, and I would later confirm much further back than that, included a grocery store charge, on the same evening as the hotel charge, in amounts ranging from $20 to $60. Sometimes there was a second charge the next morning, small, $10 or $15, from a place called Sunrise Bakery. Once, there was a charge from a pharmacy, children's Tylenol, cold medicine, the kind of thing you buy when someone in the house is sick. A man staying alone in a hotel room does not need groceries. A man staying alone in a hotel room does not need children's Tylenol. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the cursor blinking on a list of transactions that, taken individually, were each completely meaningless, and taken together were the outline of a household. Someone was buying groceries. Someone was buying breakfast pastries the next morning, the kind of thing you'd grab on your way out the door with a kid who needed to get to school. Someone, at some point, had a sick child and needed medicine. And it was happening on the same night, every month, that my husband was supposedly alone in a Marriott on 4th Street, 3 hours away, attending a regional sales meeting. Dr. Robert Weiss, the clinical social worker and infidelity researcher who wrote Prodependence, describes what he calls the parallel life structure of long-term affairs. Situations where the betraying partner isn't simply having an encounter, but has constructed, often over years, an entire second domestic reality that runs alongside the first one, with its own rhythms, its own routines, its own version of normal. He notes that these structures are almost never discovered through a single dramatic revelation. They're discovered the way mine was, through the logistics, through receipts, through the unglamorous, undramatic evidence of a life being lived, because a life, even a secret one, generates paperwork. Groceries get bought, medicine gets purchased, bicycle helmets get wrapped for 5-year-olds. None of it is designed to be evidence, it's just what living somewhere looks like. I did not confront Daniel that night. I want to be honest about why, because I think the reason matters. It wasn't fear, exactly. It wasn't even, yet, anger. That would come later, in waves, at inconvenient times, in grocery stores of my own. What I felt, sitting at that kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, with 6 months of transaction history open in front of me, was something closer to vertigo's opposite. A sudden, terrible clarity. The specific sensation of a picture resolving, like one of those images that looks like static until your eyes adjust, and suddenly you can't not see the shape hidden inside it. Once you see it, you can't go back to not seeing it. And once I saw it, I understood that if I said anything to Daniel now, tonight, on the phone, in a moment of raw and understandable anger, I would be handing him something. A warning. A chance to construct an explanation, to get ahead of it, to control how this story got told. I had spent 6 years not looking at the fabric. I was not going to spend one more night letting him weave the next part of it without me watching. So I closed the laptop. I went to bed. And the next morning, when Daniel called from Harrisburg, a quick call, 7 minutes, long day ahead, talk tonight, love you. I said love you too, in exactly the voice I always used. The voice of a woman who had no idea that anything in her life had changed. And then I opened my calendar, and I looked at the date of the next Harrisburg trip, the second Tuesday of the following month, 4 weeks away, and I did something I had never done in 22 years of marriage. I requested the day off work. I want to tell you about the 4 weeks between finding those receipts and the second Tuesday of April, because I think people imagine that period as something dramatic. A woman pacing floors, crying into wine glasses, rehearsing confrontations in mirrors. It wasn't like that. It was, on the surface, the most ordinary month of my marriage in years. I made his lunches, I asked about his day, I slept beside him every night. And some nights, I want to be honest about this, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth anything. Some nights, I lay awake next to him in the dark, listening to him breathe, and felt something I can only describe as grief for a man who was still right there. Grief for a version of him I had believed in completely, who I now understood might never have fully existed, or might have existed once and then quietly, gradually, stopped. Dr. Judith Herman, in Trauma and Recovery, writes about what she calls the dialectic of trauma, the mind's capacity to hold two contradictory realities at once when it isn't yet ready to fully process either. I was living with my husband and grieving him simultaneously. Both were true. Neither one canceled the other out. I didn't tell anyone. Not my sister, not my closest friend, not my therapist. I didn't have a therapist yet, not then. I told no one because I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that the moment I said it out loud to another person, it would become a story. Something with witnesses, something that other people would have opinions about. Something that would start moving according to its own momentum before I had decided what I wanted it to be. I wanted, for those 4 weeks, to be the only person who knew. Not because I enjoyed the secrecy, because I needed the time. I needed to decide, quietly, without an audience, who I was going to be when this stopped being a private question and became a public fact. On the second Monday of April, the night before the trip, I packed Daniel's bag the way I always did. Ironed the shirts, made sure the charger was in the side pocket. I did this, I think, partly out of habit and partly because I needed, for that morning to look exactly like every other morning. I needed him to leave the house believing nothing had changed. He kissed me goodbye in the driveway at 7:15. I waved until his car turned the corner, the same as I had 72 times before. Then I went inside, and I got dressed, and at 9 o'clock, I got in my own car, and I drove to Harrisburg. I want to describe the drive, because I think about it often. 3 hours, alone, on a highway I had never had a reason to take before. I had brought nothing with me except my phone, a bottle of water, and an address. Because here's the thing I haven't told you yet. The grocery store where the charges came from wasn't just any grocery store. It was a small, regional chain with only 4 locations, all of them clustered in a 15-minute radius on the east side of Harrisburg, nowhere near the Marriott on 4th Street, which was downtown. A man staying downtown for a one-night conference does not drive 20 minutes out of his way after a full day of meetings to shop at a grocery store in a residential neighborhood. A man going home does. I spent the drive doing something I think a lot of people would find strange, which is that I tried to imagine the version of Daniel who lived this other life. Not to torture myself, though it did, a little, but because I genuinely wanted to understand. I had been married to this man for 17 years. I knew the way he hummed when he cooked, the specific tone of voice he used when he was trying not to laugh at something he found funny but knew he shouldn't. Did that Daniel exist in this other place too? Did he hum there? Did the person who heard him hum know what it meant, the way I did? Dr. Esther Perel, the psychotherapist and author who has written extensively on infidelity, has argued in her work that one of the most difficult things for betrayed partners to accept is not that their partner was capable of deception. Most people are, under the right circumstances, but that their partner was capable of being, in some sense, fully present somewhere else. That the affection, the humming, the small domestic tendernesses weren't necessarily performed in the other life. They might have been just as real there as they were at home. Perel writes that the realization that betrayal doesn't require an absence of love, only a willingness to hold 2 loves in 2 separate rooms, is often more devastating than discovering the affair was just sex. Sex can be explained away as weakness. A second home, with groceries and birthday candles and a child's bicycle helmet, cannot. I arrived in the neighborhood a little after noon. It was an ordinary residential street. Modest houses, mature trees just beginning to bud, a kid's basketball hoop bolted above a garage door 3 houses down. I parked across the street and 1 house up from the address I had found. Found through the kind of patient, methodical searching that I won't describe in detail, except to say that once you have a credit card statement with specific store locations and specific dates, and you are willing to spend several evenings doing the quiet, unglamorous work of cross-referencing, public records will tell you more than you might expect. The house was small, pale yellow with white trim, a covered porch, a single car in the driveway, a gray sedan I didn't recognize. There was a wreath on the front door, the kind people put up for spring, made of fake forsythia branches. And on the porch, leaning against the railing, was a child's bicycle. It was pink. It had streamers on the handlebars and a white wicker basket on the front, and propped against it, hanging by its strap from one of the handlebars, was a small bicycle helmet. Purple. The kind of size that would fit a 5-year-old. I sat in my car for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock on my dashboard the entire time, the way I had watched the red numbers on the hotel nightstand clock once, years ago, on a completely different morning, in a story I am not telling you right now. At 11 minutes, the front door of the pale yellow house opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch, holding a small girl by the hand. The woman was maybe 35, dark hair, pulled back loosely, the specific tiredness in her posture that I recognized immediately because I have felt it in my own body. The tiredness of someone who has been doing the work of a household alone for a long time and has stopped expecting it to be different. She crouched down to fix something on the little girl's shoe,
a strap, a buckle, something. And the little girl said something I couldn't hear, and the woman laughed. It was an easy laugh, a familiar one. The laugh of someone who is, in this exact moment, simply having a nice morning with her daughter. I sat in my car, one house away, and I watched a woman I had never met laugh with a child I had never known existed, on a porch attached to a house I had never heard of, in a neighborhood 3 hours from the only life I had ever known belonged to my husband.
And then the woman straightened up and looked toward the street. Not at me, just generally, the way you glance at a street when you're about to walk down it. And for 1 second, her eyes passed over my car. And I realized, sitting there, that I had absolutely no plan for what happened if she saw me. The woman's eyes passed over my car and kept moving. She hadn't seen me, or if she had, I registered as nothing, just another parked car on an ordinary residential street, the kind of thing your eyes pass over 100 times a day without registering at all. She took her daughter's hand again, and they walked down the porch steps together, toward the gray sedan in the driveway, and I watched them go with the specific frozen stillness of someone who has just realized they are not breathing and has to consciously remind themselves to start again. I want to tell you what the little girl looked like, because I think about it more than almost anything else from that day. She was small, 4, maybe 5, with dark hair and 2 uneven pigtails, the kind a parent does themselves in a hurry before school, slightly lopsided in a way that was somehow more affecting than if they'd been perfect. She was wearing a yellow raincoat, even though it wasn't raining, the way kids do when they love something and want to wear it regardless of weather. She was holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear, dragging it slightly, the way kids do with the things they love most, carelessly, because love that's secure doesn't worry about being careful. I did not know this child's name. I would learn it later, Ruby. But in that moment, watching her climb into a car seat in the back of a gray sedan while her mother buckled her in, she was just a child. A real, specific, entirely innocent child who existed in the world, who had a bicycle and a yellow raincoat and a stuffed rabbit, and who had absolutely nothing to do with any decision that had been made about her existence. I think this is the part of the story that people sometimes don't expect, when I've told pieces of it since. They expect the central feeling, in that moment, to be rage. And there was rage. It came in waves over the following weeks, often when I least expected it, in grocery store parking lots and during television commercials, and once, memorably, while folding laundry, an activity that has never since felt entirely neutral to me. But that morning, sitting in my car, watching a 5-year-old climb into a car seat with a stuffed rabbit, what I felt first, before the rage, underneath it, in a way that the rage never fully covered, was something closer to tenderness. I didn't want anything to happen to that little girl. Whatever was about to happen, and I didn't yet know what that was, I found myself, in that very first moment, already worrying about her. Already hoping that whatever came next would somehow not touch her, even though I understood, even as I thought it, that this was probably not possible. That a child who has a father who comes home every second Tuesday, who has a mother who has built an entire life around those visits, was about to have something happen to her world, regardless of what I did or didn't do. Dr. Janice Abrams Spring, the clinical psychologist who wrote After the Affair, and later How Can I Forgive You?, has written about what she calls the third victim of long-term infidelity. Not the betrayed spouse, and not the unfaithful partner, but any children involved in either household, who had no say in the architecture that was built around them, and who will, regardless of how carefully the adults handle what comes next, absorb some portion of the consequences. Spring's research emphasizes that this isn't a reason to avoid the truth. Concealment, she argues, almost always causes more long-term harm to children than honesty does, even painful honesty. But it does mean, she writes, that whoever discovers a situation like this carries an additional weight, not just their own grief, but an awareness that their next decisions will ripple outward into lives that had no part in creating the situation. I sat with that weight for the rest of the morning. I didn't follow the gray sedan. I didn't get out of my car. I sat there for almost another hour, long after they'd driven away, looking at the pale yellow house with its forsythia wreath and its empty driveway, trying to understand what I was looking at. Here's what I want to explain, because I think it's the hardest part of this whole story to convey honestly. I was not looking at a stranger's house. I want to be very precise about this. I was looking at a house that contained, I could see it through the front window partially, a corner of a living room, a recliner, a specific kind of recliner, brown leather, slightly worn on the left armrest. The exact recliner that used to sit in our den before Daniel said he wanted to upgrade 4 years ago, and we donated the old one to Goodwill. He hadn't donated it, he'd moved it. I sat in my car and looked at a piece of furniture from my own living room, sitting in the front window of a house I had never been inside, belonging to a life I had never known about, and I understood, really understood for the first time, with a kind of finality that the receipts and the grocery charges hadn't quite managed to produce, that this wasn't an affair in the way I had been picturing an affair. An affair, in my mind, had been something that happened in hotel rooms and parked cars, something temporary and contained, something that existed in stolen hours. This was not stolen hours. This was furniture. This was a recliner that had been moved, deliberately, from one home to another, presumably on some pretext, presumably with effort. Someone had to load it into a truck, drive it 3 hours, unload it, find a place for it. This was years of small, practical, domestic decisions. This was, in every way that mattered except the legal one, a second marriage. Dr. Robert Weiss describes this configuration, which is rarer than people assume, but not as rare as people would like to believe, as a duplicated life, distinct from a typical affair in one crucial respect: duration and infrastructure. An affair, he writes, usually requires the unfaithful partner to maintain one coherent story and conceal a second, smaller one. A duplicated life requires maintaining 2 coherent stories simultaneously, each internally consistent, each populated with its own furniture and routines and birthdays, neither one experienced, by the person living it, as fully fraudulent. Weiss notes that people in this situation often describe, when it eventually comes to light, a strange and unsettling sincerity in both relationships. Not because they were telling the truth, because, in some compartmentalized way, each life felt complete to them while they were inside it. I thought about the shorter phone calls, the new shirts, the gym bag that had never, not once in 4 years, actually gone to a gym. And I thought about something else, something that hadn't occurred to me until that exact moment, sitting outside a pale yellow house with my own recliner in the window. If Daniel had built this, if he had spent 4 years at least constructing an entire second household, complete with furniture taken from our home, then the woman inside that house, the one with the tired posture and the easy laugh, the one currently driving her daughter somewhere in a gray sedan, almost certainly did not know about me either. Whatever story Daniel had told her about his life, about his second Tuesdays, the ones he spent 3 hours away from her, was a story I was now, without ever having met her, a character in. And I realized, sitting there, that there were 2 women in this story who had been lied to in exactly the same way, for exactly the same amount of time, by exactly the same man. And only one of us knew it yet. I did not go back to Harrisburg the following month. I want to explain why, because I think it's the part of this story that surprises people most, more than the recliner, more than the bicycle, more than almost anything else. After that first visit, I had what felt like an enormous amount of information, and almost no actual understanding. I knew what was happening. I had no idea how long, or how, or critically, whether the other woman knew about me. And I had decided, somewhere on the drive home that first day, that I was not going to act on incomplete information ever again. I had spent 6 years not looking at the fabric. I was not going to spend the next phase of my life looking at half of it. So instead of going back, I did something that I think a lot of people would find strange, and that I have since come to think of as one of the more important decisions of my life. I made an appointment with a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer, not yet. I made an appointment with an estate attorney, a woman named Carol Sue, who I'd found through a friend of a friend, someone with no connection to Daniel or anyone in our social circle, in a town 40 minutes from where I lived. I told her, in our first meeting, that I needed to understand something about property records, and I gave her the address in Harrisburg, and I asked her to find out who owned that house. I want to pause here because I think this is the moment where the story stops being about discovery and starts being about something else, something that took me months to find the right word for, and that I eventually identified, with my therapist, as agency. Dr. Judith Herman writes about this in Trauma and Recovery, the specific, disproportionate importance of small acts of control in the aftermath of a devastating discovery. Not acts that fix anything, just acts that belong entirely to the person taking them. Making an appointment, asking a question, choosing, deliberately, who gets to know what and in what order. For 6 years, information about my own marriage had flowed in one direction, from Daniel to me, filtered, curated, presented in whatever form he'd decided I should receive it. For the first time, I was the one deciding what got looked at, and when, and by whom. Carol called me back 4 days later. The house in Harrisburg was owned, free and clear, no mortgage, purchased 11 years ago. The deed was in 2 names, Daniel Ellis and a woman named Renee Castillo. 11 years, not 4, not 6, 11 years. Almost half of my marriage to Daniel, this house had existed, with his actual name on the deed. Not an alias, not a shell company, his name. Our shared last name, the one I had taken when we married, the one that was on our joint bank accounts and our mortgage and our holiday cards. Renee Castillo had been living in a house with my husband's legal name on the title for 11 years, and either she knew exactly whose name that was, in which case she had known about me the entire time and had made her own choices about what to do with that knowledge, or she didn't know, in which case Daniel had managed, for over a decade, to be Daniel Ellis in 2 completely separate worlds without either world ever producing a single piece of information that would let the other world find him. I asked Carol which scenario she thought was more likely. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I've thought about many times since. In my experience, people who are good enough at this to do it for 11 years are usually good enough at it that the other person genuinely doesn't know. The ones who get caught early are usually the ones whose partners suspected something was wrong for them to look. From what you've described, the receipts, the pattern, it sounds like neither of you suspected anything for over a decade. That's not luck. That takes real, sustained effort. On his part, not hers. I thought about Renee Castillo's laugh on that porch. Easy, familiar. The laugh of someone who believes, completely, in the life she is standing inside of. She didn't know. I was almost certain of it. And the thought of telling her, of being the person who walked into that pale yellow house and took that laugh away from her, took away 11 years of a life she believed was real, was, for a long time, the thing that stopped me from doing anything at all. Dr. Esther Perel has written about what she calls the moral injury experienced by people who discover infidelity. Not just the injury of being deceived, but the injury of being placed, against their will, in possession of information that will hurt someone else. Perel notes that betrayed partners often describe a strange, unwanted solidarity with the other woman or man, particularly when that person also appears to have been deceived. The anger, she writes, doesn't dissolve, but it gets complicated by something else, a recognition that you are looking at someone who occupies, structurally, almost the exact same position you do. Someone who trusted the same person in the same ways and was wrong about it in the same ways. I sat with that for 2 more months. During those 2 months, I did not change anything about my outward life. I still packed Daniel's bag every second Monday. I still waved from the driveway. I want to be honest. There were nights during those 2 months where I looked at him across the dinner table, this man I had built 17 years with, and felt something that wasn't quite hatred and wasn't quite grief, but was instead a kind of unbearable curiosity. I wanted to ask him things, not accusatory things.
Genuine questions. Does she know your birthday is in October, or do you tell her it's in March? Do you hum when you cook? There too? Does Ruby know your real name, or does she call you something else? I never asked, because the moment I asked anything, the moment he knew that I knew, everything would shift onto his timeline. He would get to decide what happened next. Apologize, deny, disappear, beg. I had spent 6 years on the timeline he controlled, without either of us realizing it. I was not going to hand the next chapter to him, too. What I did instead, during those 2 months, was something quieter. I went back to Carol Sue, and I asked her a different question. Not about the house this time. I asked her to find out whether, anywhere in the state of Pennsylvania, there existed a marriage license with Daniel Ellis's name on it, other than the one I was holding. Carol called me back 11 days later, and this time, before she said anything, she asked if I was sitting down.
There was a marriage license, filed 9 years ago in a county 2 hours from Harrisburg, not the same county as the house, which Carol said was itself telling because it meant whoever filed it had been careful about where they filed it, the kind of carefulness that doesn't happen by accident. Daniel Ellis, Renee Castillo, married legally on a Saturday in June 9 years ago. I was already married to Daniel at the time. We had been married for 8 years by then. There was no divorce on record. Carol checked thoroughly in both directions. Daniel Ellis had, as far as the state of Pennsylvania was concerned, 2 living wives. I want to tell you what I did with that information, because I think it's the part of the story that people find hardest to predict. And I think the reason they find it hard to predict is that they're imagining what they would do, which is usually some version of confronting Daniel immediately, calling him, screaming, demanding answers, ending it that night with the maximum possible volume. I didn't call Daniel. I called Renee. I want to explain the reasoning, because it wasn't impulsive. It was, in fact, the most carefully reasoned decision I had made in months. I had spent 2 months thinking about what would happen if I confronted Daniel first. He would know immediately that I knew. And a man who had successfully run 2 parallel lives for 11 years, who had filed a marriage license in a county he'd chosen specifically because it was unlikely to be cross-referenced, who had moved furniture 3 hours in a truck rather than simply buy new furniture. That man was not someone who would panic and confess everything on the spot. That man would manage the situation. He would have hours, maybe days, before either Renee or I confirmed anything with each other. And during those hours, he would talk to both of us. He would shape both stories. He would, very possibly, get to Renee first, tell her some version of events designed to make me the villain, the unstable wife, the woman who'd found out and was making things up or exaggerating. I was not going to let him get there first. Dr. Ramani Durvasula, the clinical psychologist who has written extensively on narcissistic personality patterns, describes a behavior she calls triangulation management, the specific skill, common among people who maintain long-term deceptions, of getting to each party in a conflict before they can compare notes with each other, and presenting each of them with a slightly different, individually tailored version of events. She notes that this isn't always a conscious strategy in the calculating sense. Sometimes it's closer to instinct, a reflex developed over years of needing to keep separate stories separate. But the effect, she writes, is the same regardless of intention. Whoever gets isolated information first gets to shape what happens next. And the only way to prevent that is for the 2 people being managed to talk to each other directly, without him in the room, and ideally without him knowing it's happening at all. So on a Thursday, not a second Tuesday, deliberately, a day when Daniel was at his actual job in our actual city, 3 hours from Harrisburg, I drove back. I brought a folder. Inside it, copies of the property deed with both names, a copy of the marriage license with both names and the date, and, this was the part I went back and forth on the longest, a photograph of Daniel and me from 2 years ago at my sister's wedding. Not to be cruel, because I needed Renee to be looking at his actual face when she understood what she was about to understand. I didn't want there to be room, even for a second, for her to wonder if this was a mistake, A different Daniel Ellis. A coincidence. I parked in the same spot as before. The bicycle was on the porch again, the purple helmet hanging from the handlebar. I sat there for less time than I had the first time, maybe 4 minutes, and then I got out of the car and I walked up to the door and I knocked. Renee opened it. Up close, she looked exactly as tired and exactly as kind as she had from across the street. Dark eyes, the specific gentleness of someone who spends most of her day crouched down at a child's height, fixing shoes and answering questions. She looked at me with the open, slightly puzzled friendliness of someone who doesn't recognize a visitor, but assumes there's a normal explanation. "Can I help you?" she said. I had rehearsed this moment more times than I could count, in the car, in the shower, lying awake at 2 in the morning. Every version I'd rehearsed had started differently, with an apology, with a question, with some softening preamble designed to ease both of us into what was coming. In the actual moment, none of that came out. What came out was simpler, and I think, looking back, it was the only version that could have worked. "My name is Margaret," I said. "I think we're married to the same man." I watched her face. I want to describe exactly what happened because I have thought about it more than almost anything else in this entire story. For 1 second, less than a second, nothing happened at all. Her expression simply held, the way a held breath holds, in that specific suspended space between hearing words and understanding them. And then I saw it, the exact moment the words landed. Not confusion. I had expected confusion, a need for clarification. What do you mean, married? Married to who? What I saw instead was something I recognized immediately, because I had felt it myself, 4 weeks earlier, sitting in my car outside this exact house. I saw the picture resolve. She didn't ask which man. She didn't ask me to explain. She looked at me. Really looked. The way you look at someone when you're searching their face for a single piece of information. And whatever she was looking for, she found it, because her hand came up slowly and pressed flat against the doorframe, the way you steady yourself against something when the ground has just, very quietly, stopped being solid. "Daniel," she said. It wasn't a question. "Daniel," I confirmed. She was quiet for a long moment. Behind her, somewhere inside the house, I could hear television. A children's show, bright music, the specific cheerful noise of a Thursday afternoon that had, until 90 seconds ago, been completely ordinary. Then Renee Castillo did something I had not expected, and that I think about more than almost anything else from that entire year. She stepped back from the door. Not to close it, to open it wider. "You should probably come in," she said, "before Ruby gets home from her friend's house. I think we have about 40 minutes.
40 minutes. That's how long Renee Castillo and I sat in her kitchen, at a table I recognized because it was the matching set to the recliner, also from our old den, also supposedly donated to Goodwill 4 years ago. Comparing the last 11 years of our lives like two people piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, where each of us had been holding exactly half the pieces the whole time. I want to tell you what those 40 minutes were like, because they were nothing like what I expected. And I think the way they actually went is the most important part of this entire story. There was no screaming. There was no blame directed at each other. And I think both of us, independently, arrived at that almost instantly, without discussing it, because the alternative made no sense. We had not done this to each other.
We had both been doing the ordinary, unremarkable things people do when they trust someone. Packing bags, remembering birthdays, building a life around a person's stated schedule. And the schedule itself had been the lie. What there was, instead, was an almost unbearable amount of recognition. Renee described Daniel's habit of humming while he cooked. I told her I knew exactly which song. She described the way he went quiet for a day or two after visiting his sister, which was, I now understood, the cover story he used on her end for the weeks he spent with me. And I told her about the headaches he claimed came from fluorescent lighting after he'd been with her. We were not comparing notes to build a case. Not yet, not in that kitchen. We were doing something closer to what Dr. Richard Tedeschi, the psychologist who developed the framework of post-traumatic growth, describes as a necessary early stage of integrating catastrophic information: narrative reconstruction. Tedeschi's research, conducted over decades with people who have survived everything from natural disasters to profound personal betrayals, found that before people can decide what to do, they often need to rebuild the story of what happened, accurately, completely, without the gaps that deception leaves behind. Two people who had each been living with half a story were, in that kitchen, for the first time, looking at the whole thing. At the 30-minute mark, Renee asked me the question I had been waiting for and dreading. What do you want to happen? I told her the truth, which was that I didn't fully know yet, except for one thing. I told her I had no interest in this becoming a fight between the two of us, over a man who had spent 11 years making sure neither of us would ever have the information needed to have that fight. I told her that whatever came next, I thought it should happen with both of us knowing everything, at the same time, in the same room if possible. Because the one thing Daniel had never allowed, in either life, was for the two halves of his story to be in the same place at once. Renee was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I have thought about many times since. Ruby gets home in 10 minutes, she said. I need you to understand. Whatever happens with him, that's not going to touch her. I need that to be true no matter what. I told her I understood, and I meant it, more than she could have known, because I had been worrying about exactly that since the moment I'd seen the yellow raincoat from my car, weeks earlier. I left before Ruby got home. We exchanged numbers. And we agreed, both of us, calmly, in a kitchen that belonged to neither of our old lives but somehow contained furniture from both of them, that neither of us would say anything to Daniel until we had spoken to a lawyer. Together this time. Carol Sue, as it turned out, was more than happy to take on a second client whose interests were, for once, completely aligned with the first. What happened over the following months I'm going to describe briefly, because the legal and financial parts of this story, while significant, are not, in the end, the part that matters most. Bigamy is a crime in Pennsylvania. A relatively minor one, as crimes go, but it is a crime, and more importantly, it is the kind of crime that, once documented, makes every other part of the situation legally simple in a way that ordinary infidelity never is. A second marriage, performed while a first marriage is legally valid, is void from the moment it occurs. It doesn't need to be annulled. It was never real, in the eyes of the law, which meant that everything Daniel had built with Renee over 9 years, every joint account, every piece of property with both their names on it, existed in a strange legal no-man's land that took attorneys on both sides the better part of a year to fully sort out. Daniel did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that, because I know some people reading this will want a different ending. Bigamy prosecutions are rare, and in the end, the district attorney's office treated it as a civil matter rather than a criminal one. A decision both Renee and I, separately, decided not to fight, because neither of us wanted Ruby's father in jail. That was Renee's choice to make primarily, and I respected it completely. What Daniel lost was almost everything else. The legal marriage, mine, was the one that mattered, in every practical sense. Renee, through Carol's careful work, received a settlement that reflected 11 years of a life built in good faith, even though that life had never been what she believed it was. I divorced Daniel 6 months later, on grounds that required almost no explanation to a judge, because the facts, once laid out, explain themselves. The hardest part, harder than the lawyers, harder than the financial unwinding, harder even than the conversation with Daniel himself, which I will not describe in detail because it does not deserve more space in this story than it already has, was the months afterward. The early mornings, the specific quality of waking up in a house that no longer needed to be quiet for anyone, and discovering that quiet, when you've spent decades filling it with someone else's schedule, takes time to learn how to hold. Renee and I still talk.
Not often, every few months, usually around Ruby's birthday, which I now know is in March, and which I have, with Renee's permission, sent a small gift to every year since. Not because I need to be part of that little girl's life. Because Ruby didn't choose any of this. And because somewhere, very early on, sitting in my car outside a pale yellow house, I had promised myself that whatever else happened, I would not let this become something that made her world smaller. Dr. Tedeschi's research on post-traumatic growth identifies a specific marker that distinguishes people who eventually find something meaningful on the other side of catastrophic betrayal from those who remain stuck inside it. The capacity, even while still grieving, to extend something, attention, kindness, a small act of care, towards someone else affected by the same event. Not forgiveness, necessarily, not even closeness. Just the recognition that you are not the only person standing in the wreckage, and that how
You treat the others standing there with you becomes, eventually, part of your own story too. I think about the recliner sometimes. It's gone now. Renee sold the house in Harrisburg 2 years ago and moved closer to her own family. And I have no idea what happened to that piece of furniture, which had already lived 2 lives by the time I saw it through a stranger's window. But I think about it because of what it represented in the end. Not deception. Something simpler and, in its way, sadder. A man who had spent years moving pieces of one life into another, trying to make 2 incomplete things each feel whole, and who never once considered what would happen if the 2 women living those lives ever sat down together at the table he'd built for both of them and simply talked. He never imagined that conversation. That was his mistake. Not the lies, not the second house, not even the marriage that was never legally real. He never imagined we'd talk to each other. We did.